In 1889, the main attraction of the Paris Exposition was the completion of what would be called the Eiffel Tower, a 300-meter tall structure built specifically for the event to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, and subsequently the start of the French Revolution. Also at the event were art exhibits with paintings by some of the best artists in the world. One of those artists was Elizabeth Jane Gardner, and her painting The Farmer's Daughter was part of the display at the American Gallery. This same painting 2 years earlier had won her a medal in the 1887 Paris Salon, making her the first American female ever to do so. But sometimes with success comes controversy. That year, the president of the Salon jury was none other than celebrated French artist William Bouguereau, Elizabeth's painting instructor, and her fiancé. Elizabeth's response to whispers of bias was that the very reason William held that post as long as he did was because of his notorious impartiality. She notes that, quote, "He has always said that I must succeed through my own merit and not through his influence." In spite of these rumors, these events would catapult her career and result in her becoming one of the most sought-after artists of the 19th century. But William would always overshadow her. He was a phenomenally successful artist with a constant flow of commissions on his plate. Now, because Elizabeth began her career as a copyist, she wasn't afraid to pick up some of Williams's techniques and style, for which she sometimes received criticism. To this, she responded, "I know I'm censured for not more boldly asserting my individuality, but I would rather be known as the best imitator of Bouguereau than be nobody." According to her obituary in the New York Times, Elizabeth Gardner Bouguereau literally opened Paris ateliers to the women of the world. But she wasn't the only female artist to marry a male artist with a larger-than-life reputation. Laura Epps was a British artist who at the age of 19 married Lawrence Alma-Tadema, an up-and-coming Dutch painter and Bouguereau's contemporary. During their lifetimes, Lawrence gained more recognition for his work, even receiving a knighthood in 1899. But Laura wasn't far behind, exhibiting at the Paris Salon and in London by the time she was 21. Not to mention, her work was part of the German Imperial Collection. Both artists disappeared from history until rediscovered again in the latter half of the 20th century. One artist who didn't fare as well was Welsh artist Gwen John, overshadowed by both her brother, Augustus John, one of the most important artists of his time, and her lover, Auguste Rodin, the famed sculptor. She wouldn't gain real recognition until after her death, in 1939. Interestingly, her brother apparently thought she was the better painter of the two. While some female artists had to deal with being overshadowed by their husbands, there are others whose association with renowned male artists was more beneficial to their careers. Lilla Cabot Perry was an American artist who grew up in Boston's cultured society in the mid-1800s and married Thomas Sargent Perry, a writer and teacher, brother-in-law to artist John Lafarge, and distant relative to the famed Commodore Matthew C. Perry. Lilla was initially consumed with raising their 3 daughters, but at the age of 36, she began learning the art of painting. And a year later, when the family traveled on a 2-year European tour, Lilla took the opportunity to study at 2 art academies in Paris and spent her summers in the Norman countryside. It was there that she developed a lifelong friendship with Claude Monet. The family spent 9 summers living near him, during which time she consulted him in her work. Each year, when she returned to Boston, she worked to promote the concept of Impressionism in the United States. Thanks partly to her efforts, the new style became familiar to American audiences. She continued to paint until just before her death at 86. Another woman influenced by a famous male artist was Marguerite Gerard, a French woman and sister-in-law to Jean-Henri Fragonard, a brilliant and successful Rococo painter. She was an unofficial apprentice to him, and his association to her helped add credibility to her work. Her work and her reputation were pretty much on par with female contemporaries such as Anne Coster, Adelaide Guillard, and Elizabeth Lebrun, although she separated herself by preferring to paint genre paintings as opposed to portraits or still life, which were considered more appropriate for women in her time. Her patrons included King Louis VIII and Napoleon, as well as other wealthy citizens of the time. Anyone interested in modern or abstract art will know the name Wassily Kandinsky, an artist often considered to be one of the fathers of abstract art. One of his students, and eventually his lover, was Gabriele Munter, but she also became his professional colleague. Their collaboration is part of what led to a new painting style. In the early 1900s, together with several other artists, they founded the movement known as Der Blaue Reiter, or the Blue Rider, an avant-garde movement that explored the use of color and form as a way to express the spiritual. Prior to the group's development, Gabriele experimented with her own artistic style, challenging herself to paint the feelings she encountered when she looked at a scene, rather than just the reality. As her work developed, she never allowed herself to be stuck in a specific movement. Instead, she strove to paint how she wanted to paint, and is quoted as saying, "It's all too easily forgotten that a woman can be a creative artist with a real original talent of her own." After several traveling exhibits, the group came to an end when World War I broke out in 1914. 2 key members were killed in the war, and Kandinsky and another artist had to flee to Russia due to their Russian heritage. This not only put an end to the group, but also ended Gabriele's relationship with Kandinsky. During World War II, she hid her collection of Der Blaue Reiter paintings, knowing that modern forms of art were targets for destruction. Thus, she preserved some important works for history. During the war, she also had to change her art style, conforming in order to use it as a barter for food, until after the war when her paintings would become much sought after. Her work is often overshadowed by Kandinsky's, but her actions and her importance, as well as her talent, played an important role in the development of modern art movements. Another woman who made an impact on modern painting movements was Alma Thomas, an abstract painter who was inspired by the shapes and colors that she saw in nature. Her creative ingenuity made her an important member of what's known as the Washington Color Field School, and she's the first African-American woman to have a painting as part of the official White House collection. There were other genres that were impacted by talented female artists, to include the genre of still life, and one of the earliest women responsible for popularizing it was Fede Galizia. She was an Italian still life and portrait painter from the late 1500s. Galizia was said to be a child prodigy and was considered accomplished by the age of 12. Her paintings are some of the earliest Italian still lifes known and helped shape the genre in general. The exact date of Galizia's death is unknown, but we know she died in Milan around the time that the city was being racked by the bubonic plague in 1630, an event that killed a quarter of the city's population. Illness is unfortunately a part of life, but sometimes physical ailments can be the factor needed to push someone into the path they were meant to pursue. For example, German-born Swiss painter Louise Breslau was born with a severe case of chronic asthma. As a child, it sometimes kept her bedridden, where, with limited things to do, she picked up drawing as a way to bide her time. This served as a foundation for her eventual pursuit of art as a career, becoming an incredibly talented and successful oil and pastel painter. She trained at the Académie Julian, and upon completion of her studies, opened her own studio from which she was able to support herself with her art. Not only was she a member of the prestigious Société Nationale des Beaux-Arts, but she also sat on the Salon jury. She was the first foreign woman and the third woman ever to receive the Legion of Honor, the highest French order of merit. Anita Malfatti was a Brazilian artist who was born with a severe defect in her dominant arm. Several surgeries were attempted but failed to solve the problem, leaving her with a nearly useless right arm. But she adapted, using her left arm for all of her activities, including learning to paint as a student in Berlin, where she was exposed to experimental painting methods. After Berlin, she moved to Paris, where she picked up aspects of the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist movements. Her last move before returning to Brazil was a stint in New York, where she studied under Homer Boss, further expanding the freedom in her art. By the time she returned to her home country in 1917, when she first exhibited her work, its cutting-edge style caused public outrage. In the end, however, it was her work, among others, that exposed Brazilians to the up-and-coming modernistic movements. And by the end of her life, she was highly successful. And one of the most notable female painters in Canadian history was artist Helen McNicoll, who as a young child had developed scarlet fever, leaving her nearly deaf for the rest of her life, forcing her to read lips as a way to function in society. Being deaf was a difficulty she had to live with, but she had the benefit of being born into a wealthy family, which allowed her the freedom to experiment and express herself in her work. Basically, she didn't have to rely on sales to survive. It also gave her an advantage in that she was connected to art enthusiasts and dealers. In spite of these advantages, her merit is built on skill, which was exceptional and earned her acceptance into the Royal Society of British Artists and the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts. Eventually, she moved to London and would send her impressionistic work back to Canada for exhibitions. Because of this, she was instrumental in helping to expand the interest in Impressionism throughout Canada, just as Lilla Perry helped popularize it in the United States. When World War I broke out, she was working in France, but was forced to leave due to her father's position and her subsequent importance. She returned to England where, sadly, she died from a diabetic attack at the young age of 35. But Helen McNicoll was not the only woman to die at a young age. Clarice Beckett was an Australian artist and an important member of the Australian tonalist movement. She was born into a fairly wealthy family, her father being in banking, but he wasn't a fan of her career choice. Her mother, on the other hand, encouraged her and made a way for her to attend the National Gallery Art School, where she studied under Frederick McCubbin, a superb draftsman, and Max Meldrum, a very skilled tonalist. After completing her education, she returned to her home, where her father refused to set up a studio for her. So, Clarice decided to take her painting efforts outside, on location, and even constructed a little painting cart on which she could carry her supplies as needed. She was so committed to her work that she would get up in the early hours or walk miles on foot just to catch the right lighting or find the right spot. As we've seen with other artists, not having to survive on your work allows you to experiment and develop your own style. In her case, tonalism. Unfortunately, one of her outings took place at night during a storm where she caught pneumonia and shortly after died. She was only 48. 30 years after her death, a gallery owner discovered her work through Clarice's sister, only to learn that after her death, most of her paintings were stored in an open barn in rural Australia. Of her nearly 2,000 completed paintings, only 369 survived exposure to the elements. Although she did exhibit her work, she hardly sold any paintings in her lifetime. But today, her paintings are found in major public galleries, including the National Gallery of Australia. One artist who fared a little better than Clarice was Polish artist Anna Bilinska. She was born in Imperial Russia and began taking private painting lessons and then studying art at the Académie Julian in Paris as a young adult, around the same time as Louise Breslau. She gained early acclaim for her work and eventually exhibited in Paris salons as well as other prestigious exhibits. After marrying, Anna was planning to open an art school for women in Warsaw, using the methods she learned in Paris, when she suddenly fell ill and died at the young age of 35. During her short life, she won many awards for her work, including at the 1889 Paris Exposition. And then we have Eva Gonzales, who studied under the artist Charles Chaplin and then under Edouard Manet. She was Manet's only formal student. Eva was considered an impressionist, although, like Manet, never exhibited with the group, and is said to have used black in her work. She instead chose to exhibit her work in the Paris salons. She was extremely talented and fairly successful, but died before reaching her 35th birthday. The next two artists didn't die young, but they both had to deal with some extreme life circumstances. Life always involves challenges, such as Clarice Beckett's issue with her father or the issue of being in the shadow of a talented spouse. But some life challenges are unusually difficult. For example, consider the life of Julie Wolfthorn, who for the most part lived a good long life, but at the end endured unusual suffering. She was born in Thorn, Germany, and over time developed an impressionistic style that leaned towards modernistic. By the beginning of the 1900s, and through most of her adult life, she was considered one of the top female painters in Germany, painting portraits of some of the leading figures in society. But she was of Jewish descent, and with the rise of the Nazi Party in the 1930s and 40s, she was eventually disbarred from being an artist and was shortly after sent to a concentration camp, where she died 2 years later at the age of 80. Another woman who dealt with extreme life situations was Edmonia Lewis. Edmonia may have had the most fascinating life of all of these women. She was born to a free African-American man and a native Chippewa Indian woman, both of whom died when Edmonia was only 5 years old. For the next 12 years, she wandered the countryside with the Chippewa tribe, until her older brother left the tribe to pursue gold mining in the West. From his profits, he was able to support Edmonia's education, eventually enabling her to attend Oberlin College in Ohio, one of the first colleges in the country to accept women and citizens of African descent. Unfortunately, during her time there, she was accused of poisoning her 2 roommates, which led to her being attacked by an angry mob who beat her up. She was soon acquitted of the crime, but was then accused of stealing art supplies, costing her the ability to graduate. Undeterred, and through the support of her brother, Edmonia moved to Boston, where she studied sculpting with a local artisan. She began producing portrait medallions and formal busts of prominent abolitionists, which became very popular and eventually paid for her to move to Rome, where she set up her own sculpting studio. Rome was strategically situated for sculptors due to its access to white marble. Her work grew in popularity until she obtained international recognition for her artistic sensitivity and talent. She was last known to still reside in Rome in 1911, but much of her life still remains a mystery. While Edmonia lived in Rome, she became acquainted with a fellow female sculptor by the name of Harriet Hosmer. Hosmer was the first professional American female sculptor. In an effort to learn more about the human form so she could improve her art, Harriet took private anatomy classes in St. Louis while studying sculpting. And in 1852, she moved to Rome, where she continued her studies and where she eventually established her own studio. She was one of the few female sculptors to be able to support herself with her craft. In 1859, while working on one of her most famous pieces, Zenobia, she received a visit at her studio by the current Prince of Wales and future King of England, Edward VII. Harriet became a center point for a small group of American female sculptors who worked together in Rome, to include Edmonia Lewis. Previously, we mentioned two American female sculptors from the late 1800s to early 1900s. But the very first female sculptor dates all the way back to the early 1500s. Properzia de Rossi was an Italian artist from Bologna. Painting careers for women during the Renaissance were rare, but even more rare was the field of sculpting. It's a physically demanding craft, and so was seen as unfit for women. But Properzia was feisty and determined. Since she was unable to gain access to the proper tools and supplies, she began her career by carving fruit stones or pits, which she produced with such delicacy and detail that her reputation began to take off. She eventually obtained commissions for important projects, such as producing carvings for the filigreed Grossi family crest and creating multiple reliefs for the Basilica of San Petronio. In spite of her success, de Rossi died penniless from the plague in 1530, the same week that Pope Clement VII was arranging to meet her. She's the only woman to receive an entire chapter in the historic book by Giorgio Vasari titled The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, published in 1550. One artist that stands out both in skill and overall professionalism was Michaelina Wautier, a Flemish artist who painted all the way back in the 1600s. Michaelina is said to have begun painting seriously later in life, around the age of 39, and once working professionally is said to have maintained a studio in Brussels with her brother Charles, who was also a painter. After her death, many of her paintings were wrongly attributed to either her brother, to Jacob van Oost, or to a student of Peter Paul Rubens with a similar last name. In fact, she was completely forgotten until rediscovered in the late 20th century. Michaelina painted in a wide variety of genres, but her work with historical paintings is the most impressive. She worked in this genre a generation before Giuliana Lama. Unlike Lama, Michaelina didn't have the advantage of working with live models, as women were completely excluded from that form of study at the time, making her work even more impressive. And her floral paintings are a testament to her subject diversity. It's assumed that she must have established herself as a leading artist in Brussels because some of her works are included in the collection of Archduke Leopold Wilhelm, governor of the Spanish Netherlands at the time. She's the only female included in the collection. One thing that stands out to me about Michaelina is how she portrays herself in her self-portrait. There's a professionalism about her portrayal that seems remarkable for the 1600s. Such independence in her expression. She had a unique style, broad subject matter, an air of confidence, and accurate representation of the male body that makes her an impressive pioneer in the field of art. We'll close with an artist whose work communicates the complexity of the human psyche. She captures suppressed emotion and does it through a style all her own. I'm talking about Olga Boznanska, one of the most renowned of all female Polish artists. Olga was born to a fairly wealthy family, and like many others, was encouraged to pursue art by her mother. But her inspiration to become a professional painter is said to have begun on a family trip across Europe, where she was especially impacted by the work of Diego Velázquez. After her initial training in Krakow and then in Munich, she earned a gold medal for one of her portraits at a competition in Vienna, an event that would be instrumental in catapulting her career. Soon after, she would gain international recognition and set up a studio in Paris, where she eventually became a member of the Société Nationale des Beaux-Arts and was awarded the French Legion of Honor in 1912. Her career began to ebb a bit after societal changes due to World War I, but her real withdrawal from society took place after the tragic suicide of her sister and the start of World War II, which closed her off from her remaining family in Poland. Olga died in 1940 alone at the Hospital of the Sisters of Mercy in Paris, but her place in art is established. She's remembered for her sitters, who are often deep in thought and portrayed in colors that are quite subdued. Olga's comment about this was, quote, "My paintings look great because they are the truth. They are fair, yours. There is no narrow-mindedness, no mannerism, and no bluff." I could go on and on. The number of female artists in history continues to surprise.